Hi, I'm John Geoghegan with the long-awaited conclusion to my short story, The Eighth Dwarf, about the making of Walt Disney's first animated feature. As you may recall in our last installment, Sleazy continued his fruitless search for Snow White. Meanwhile, during the 1950s, Walt blackballed Sleazy by proclaiming him a communist in front of the Un-American Activities Committee. And during that time, Walt's career just skyrocketed. He opened his theme park, he had a successful Sunday evening television show, and he was on everybody's A-list. And then our last installment concluded in 1963 when Sleazy invited our narrator to have breakfast at the Polo Lounge, where Sleazy pitched our narrator on asking Walt to cast him as Jane Banks, the 8-year-old daughter in Mary Poppins. Our narrator agreed to do it, but was not hopeful. So now for the final conclusion of The Eighth Dwarf. After I brokered Sleazy's meeting with Walt, I tried to find out how it went, but Walt wouldn't return my calls. When I tried buttonholing him at work, he ducked me. Then one morning, over a glass of fresh orange juice, I noticed an item in the Hollywood Reporter announcing that Karen Dotrice, a real 8-year-old girl, had been cast in the role of Jane Banks. As far as I knew, that was the end of it. Little did I know the next time I'd see Sleazy would be my last. 2 years passed. Then out of the blue, an invitation to the LA premiere of Mary Poppins appeared in my mailbox. I knew it wasn't from Walt. We hadn't spoken in nearly as long. But when I flipped the invitation over, I was surprised to see Sleazy's scrawl. Hope you can make it. All your questions will soon be answered. Sleazy, it read. Since the Mary Poppins premiere was the biggest social event of 1965, I had no intention of declining. The truth was that things hadn't been good for me since I'd fallen out with Walt. I needed to put in some serious FaceTime in this town, or people would start to think I'd retired. All your questions will soon be answered sounded intriguing enough to justify a night of humiliation. So with a hint of envy and a dollop of bitterness, I donned my tux and went to the premiere. Walt was opening his movies at Grauman's Chinese Theater in those days, but since I wasn't part of the production team, I had to go in through the side door. It was the usual circus. I kept a lookout for Sleazy, but have you ever tried spotting a dwarf among 800 people? About the only way I'd find him is if he stuck his hand up Julie Andrews' dress and she hit a high C. The picture was okay, if you like that sort of thing, though it was a bit saccharine for my taste. I didn't wait until the credits finished before committing the unpardonable breach in this town of making a dash for the lobby in hopes of intercepting Sleazy. Fortunately, I only had to wait a few minutes before he emerged from the theater with a group of well-wishers surrounding him. He was making his way toward the exit when I called his name. This is a town where everybody knows exactly where they stand in the pecking order. Sleazy's star was clearly on the ascendant, while mine had virtually disappeared. But to his credit, Sleazy stopped when he saw me, waved me over, and motioned his hangers-on to depart. "Sleazy," I said, shaking his hand, "great to see you. You look terrific." As I said these words, I heard a familiar voice behind me, its chirpiness mellowed by the years. "Hi, Roy. How you been?" When I turned around, there was Snow White. She'd had some work done, but there was no mistaking it was her. The slinky black dress she wore was a perfect complement to Sleazy's tux, though it left a lot less to the imagination. Snow White slipped past me to stand behind Sleazy, her long white fingers resting comfortably on his shoulder. He held her hand for a moment, gazed up at her adoringly, then fixed me with a hard look. "It took a while to figure out who my friends were, Roy, but I finally realized you weren't one of them." "What do you mean?" I said, the heat of betrayal warming my face. "You pretended to be my friend, Roy, but the whole time you were squealing to your brother." "What do you expect, Sleazy? We share the same last name. Don't be naive." "Not naive. I liked you, Roy, but I should have put two and two together. You were the one supplying Snowy with the white stuff. You were also the one who told Walt she was pregnant. You know how I know? I was the only person she told, and the only person I told was you." Listening to Sleazy meant bending over so far you felt his breath against your cheek, but his accusations were so damning they made me straighten up and take a step backwards. "You also were the one who had her deported," Sleazy continued. "I know, it was on Walt's orders, but look where it got you. You're as bad as Walt, Roy, maybe worse. At least Walt was upfront with me." I knew what Sleazy was saying was true. As Walt's older brother, I'd been his Mr. Fix-It for many years. In other words, Sleazy may have been the eighth dwarf, but I was the second Disney. It was natural that Walt's dirty work should fall to me. It may not have been fun standing in my baby brother's shadow, but it certainly was remunerative. Nevertheless, there were questions I needed answered. I just couldn't help myself. "So what happened in your meeting with Walt, Sleazy? Why didn't you get the part?" "I never had any intention of auditioning for Mary Poppins, dummy. I just wanted a meeting with Walt. I'd heard the rumors like everybody else. I figured if we buried the hatchet, he might help me." Help you what?" "Find me," Snow White purred, and she leaned down to give Sleazy a kiss so sexy it rearranged my pants. "Walt found her?" "It wasn't easy," Sleazy admitted. "She'd changed her last name, which made her difficult to find. Then after Treblinka was liberated, she moved to Israel and lived on a kibbutz. I'd never been able to do it without his resources. If she's alive, I'll find her, Walt told me. It took 2 years, but here she is. And tonight, we celebrate." At first, I wondered whether Sleazy's story could possibly be true. But if I had any doubts, they died the moment I saw Walt. He was passing by, accompanied by P.L. Travers, the frumpy British author of Mary Poppins books. She was haranguing him over every little detail she hated about his picture. He looked miserable, but when he glanced in our direction and our eyes locked with mine, he immediately looked away. It's amazing what little things can tell you. Maybe Walt was still mad at me, or maybe he was looking to do a little legacy polishing. Whatever his intent, I didn't envy being in his shoes, not with what I knew. I had to hand it to Sleazy, though. Everything he said was true, and then some. Sure, I felt bad for the moment, but that's the good thing about feelings. They soon pass. Before Sleazy could leave, however, I knelt down in front of him and placed my hand on his shoulder. He shrinked from my touch. "Walt's finished with you, Roy, and so am I," he said. "That may be, Sleazy. Still, I'm glad you found Snow White." Sleazy looked coldly at me before giving Snow White's hand a tug. "Come on, Dollface. Let's get out of here." I watched them exit the lobby, when who should they bump into outside the front door but the man himself. The crowd had dispersed by now, and Walt was standing alone, smoking a cigarette under the now darkened marquee. He smiled when he saw them and beckoned them to join him. As they leaned against a Chinese-inspired pillar, puffing an unfiltered Camel, Walt took Snow White's hand. I lingered just out of sight to hear what my brother said. "I know you kids had it rough," Walt began, "but let me share something." Before he could continue, he was racked by a cough so deep it was painful to hear. "Excuse me," he said in his unfailingly polite manner, then lit another cigarette. My father, Elias Disney, was a hard man. First thing he said when I was born was I looked like a rodent. And he wasn't being funny. He was a stern guy, used to discipline us with a switch, had no joy in him whatsoever. Walt paused to take a drag from his cigarette. The old man had a lot of financial problems when I was a kid, so we moved around a lot. When I was 9, I had my first newspaper route. Got up to 3:30 every morning to deliver the Kansas City Star before school. It was freezing in the winter, which is really saying something in Missouri. After school, I'd walk the same route to deliver the afternoon edition. There wasn't much time for fun and games. When I was a bit older, I went to work alongside my father cleaning bottles in a jelly factory. Then when I turned 15, Roy and I took summer jobs as butcher boys, selling candy and sandwiches on trains between KC and Jefferson. After the war, I didn't want to work in that jelly factory again, so I began to draw. Soon I was making $50 a week, more than Roy, who worked at a bank. Finally, in August of 23, I went to Hollywood. All I had was $40 in my pocket and a suitcase full of drawing materials. Truth is, I wanted to be a director, but had to settle for cartoons. Funny how things work out. Walt dropped his cigarette and stubbed it out with the toe of his black patent leather shoe. Slizzy couldn't help but notice its beautiful grosgrain bow. Early on in my career, Universal stole the rights to Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. It was the only successful cartoon property I had. Hell, they took half my animators, too. It was a hard lesson, but I swore never to let it happen again. That's how Mickey Mouse came to be. It wasn't easy making cartoons. I churned out 75 silly symphonies in 10 years. We talk about the magic, but never how hard it is to make. The truth is, and here Walt's eyes hardened, life has been one hard scrabble. I've climbed over everybody and everything to get where I am. It's the only way I know to get ahead in this world, and even if it doesn't always work, maybe that explains some things I've done. Maybe not. Walt paused for a moment as he thought the thoughts of a man who thinks it's in the final stages of lung cancer. My father was never successful. Some say he was born disappointed. Who knows? Whatever the reason, I wasn't going to let the same thing happen to me. Then Walt said something curious. It's a confusing, dangerous world, Sleazy, beyond any man's control. I entertain people so they don't have to think about that stuff. It's not my job to tell the truth. That's somebody else's. Life has a habit of teaching you anyway. That night was almost enough to make you feel sorry for Walt Disney. Kids estranged, wife didn't care, oldest brother pushed aside, and on top of that, only a few months left to live. Of course, Walt was a blatant self-dramatist. He often told two versions of the same story, depending on his audience. The first was usually closest to the truth. The second he embellished to make himself look good. But if this was Walt's Citizen Kane moment, I don't think he knew it. The last thing he said that night to the happy couple was, "Oh, excuse me, there's a distributor over there I have to see. We're having a few problems in the South." A year later, he was dead. Walt Disney, all of 65. You probably know the rest. Sleazy and Snow White got married, moved to Ojai, and opened a gift shop. Snowy took care of the books, read Rilke, and sang in the church choir, while Sleazy worked the cash register and regaled their customers with hilarious stories about the old days in Hollywood. It was a quieter, simpler life, but both of them were happy. Sleazy died of a heart attack in 1972. His health had never been great, poor guy. Since they no longer kept up with the industry, it was some time before I heard the news. The trades didn't even publish his obituary. God knows how old Snow White is today. She's got to be well past 100. They say the good die young, but what they don't tell you is that the mean live forever. I, for one, am still alive and glad of the fact. I inherited the studio, actually, when Walt died. Everybody pretty much gets what they want in life, if not what they deserve. If you're disappointed to hear this, I'm not surprised. Audiences are such saps for happy endings. But happy endings only happen in Hollywood, which is something Walt understood. Maybe that's why he was the way he was. What do you think life is, anyway? A fairy tale? And that concludes the Eighth Dwarf. Thanks so much for listening.